what's going on? It's another episode of Film Streak. And, some of these episodes, I go back and watch some old movies. In the last episode, I talked about some films from 2024 and just kind of had like a grab bag of a bunch of different things. Some of them, I didn't really know how to group them or pair them up with other things. I want to talk about a film I just saw from 2024, from this year, that is a remake of a film that just came out not too long ago, and that is Speak No Evil. Now, the original film is from 2022, and it's a Danish Dutch production, and it's by a writer and director who I can't say I've seen any previous work, but I think there's something really really special about this filmmaker and his approach to telling this kind of a story. Because look, the idea of a family and they meet another couple while they're on vacation and they kind of strike up some conversation and kind of seems like they might be kind of fast friends, right? So the couple that they meet, they're a little more forward facing, they're a little more aggressive. So they invite them to come and visit and hang out in their farm on the countryside. And this is true. This plays out the almost the exact same way in both films. The way the original film does something about these two couples, I think that works a little better. Because in the original film, there is a factor of the languages that are being used, right? Now, most of the film is in English, and yet there are moments where these characters go into Danish or they go into Dutch. And you can see like there's a little bit of a disconnection because there are no subtitles, at least in the version of it that I watched. There are no subtitles when they speak a language other than English. And so I think it's intended to show an audience, at least an English speaking audience, like, oh, here's a moment that you are supposed to be uncertain of what exactly is happening or what, at least what's being said. And I think that adds a sort of tension that on its face is kind of mundane. It kind of really doesn't mean anything. But when you have these people who kind of live different lives, different lifestyles, these couples, they kind of get cross with each other at different moments. And both of these films work in that same territory of exploring the like microaggressions or these sort of like side eye that people give each other and the things that they want to say but maybe they don't say because of they don't want to be impolite or disrespectful or rude, but at the same time the things that you might say and you might not realize how you're affecting somebody's interpretation or their mood or their feelings. And I think it's a really interesting approach because this is, for the most part, it is kind of just a family drama until it gets to a certain point, and then it becomes a thriller, even a bit of a horror film. But there's nothing that is so outlandish or fantastical that it kind of breaks reality. I think I've said it in a previous episode or two that sometimes the best horror movies aren't the ones where you've got obvious monsters or creatures or demons, but it's the ones where you've got those types of elements in regular people and in regular situations. And so this film, the original, I think does a little bit better job of living in that gray zone, where you've got these couples who they're trying to feel each other out. They're trying to maybe understand and maybe say things, but then back away from things. And they're just trying to find the sweet spot for where they can have, let's say, a friendship, right? And look, if you are an adult living life, you've got a family, you've got a home, there's a point in everybody's life, I think, where it does become hard or it just becomes less accessible to just have relationships with other adults, other friendships. You get busy with your family, with your kids, with your home, your career, all that stuff. It gets so much to the front of your mind that you forget, like, hey, sometimes you still want to be able to connect with other people, new people, and not just like in a moment or in a situation, but like have real friendships. And that's not always easy to do. And this film, I think it's a look at what those anxieties are, what those sort of concerns are, what those I mean, you could even just say straight outright fears are of meeting new people and maybe finding out that, oh, the person that you kind of thought maybe you had a little bit of a bond with, you had some things in common, maybe you don't. Like maybe you don't actually know this person or another couple, like in the case of this film. And what would be like the worst way to play that out, right? Like, oh, you met a couple, things were a little weird, a little uncomfortable, but you still seem to be pretty pleasant, and things were mostly genial on the surface. But what about what happens behind closed doors? You know, I think anybody who's, you've had to deal with things in life, and sometimes you can find yourself in a place where you're not very trusting, whether it comes to your partner, whether it comes to your children, whether it comes to just your way of life. It's hard to sometimes let other people into that, or to see how other people live their lives and be able to accept it, right? So this film, both of these films, I think they really do explore that in tiny little ways, and sometimes it's glances, sometimes it's little snide remarks, or these characters kind of throwing little darts at each other when it could seem like just a very kind of innocent or innocuous kind of thing to happen in a conversation or in a moment, but it does turn into something bigger and it hints at other things, right? So both of these films, I think, work pretty well in that regard. The interesting thing here, watching these films together, kind of as a double feature, I guess. I mean, I wanted to see the original, but then when I saw the remake was coming out, I think it was earlier this year, and it just landed on Peacock. So that's a place to watch it if you maybe want to see the remake, maybe because it's a little more geared for, let's say, English speaking or American audiences, maybe. And yet at the same time, I think that is kind of what doesn't make it as strong. There is a definite difference between the two films. I think the original film, it feels a lot more kind of disconnected from the world. And by that, I mean the setting, I mean some of the locations. I mean, you kind of feel like these characters are in a bubble and they are isolated. And in a way, it becomes claustrophobic. There are moments when, the couple that goes to visit in the original film, it's a Danish family, right? It's a man and a wife and their daughter. They go to visit this other couple with their little boy. And there are a couple of times where it kind of gets uneasy, it gets a little uncomfortable, and they try to kind of back out of the situation. Like, hey, we kind of had a good time. This isn't quite working out. We're going to go ahead and head out. And it doesn't happen. And I think, there's a certain sensibility to these characters that in another part of the world, another part of the country, like this situation doesn't play out this way. It moves much faster. It's over. There's not a movie, right? So you have these characters that are maybe leaning a little more towards the idea of being polite and being amiable, right? Even when some of these characters clearly have something else going on, but you can't quite peg what it is until a certain point, it just seems like, oh, all right, oops, I stepped over the line. I'll back up, it's okay. It'll be all right, all that stuff. And so that's the whole dance that these films do. But the remake, the reason I say I kind of feel like it goes into like a more American type of conventional story, it becomes much more of a thriller slash horror slash even action film in a way. Like there's an actual explosion towards the end of the film. And I really kind of told myself of like, well, look, the remake, it's going to try and juice some things up, right? They're going to give it a little bit more energy, do something to really set it apart from the original. Okay. And I said, watch, somehow they're going to work an explosion in this film. Sure enough, they do. And I think I mean, look, that notwithstanding, I think the problem with the remake is that it goes in a whole different direction. And I think it ends up kind of diffusing the whole thing. The original film, if you haven't seen either of these films, I don't want to really spoil the endings, but there are two very different endings. And I'll just say this, the original film is much darker, much more bleak in its outlook for this type of situation for these characters and where they go from here. And I can't say I'm necessarily surprised. I mean, I feel like that's something that a foreign film, maybe even just from this part of the world, I feel like they're a little more comfortable with going there, right? With challenging you as a viewer, as the audience, to see like, would you be able to tolerate like this kind of an ending to a story? I feel like that's sort of the dare that gets drawn out when you get a lot of foreign films. With American films, I feel like the idea is like, well, we just want to make sure the biggest possible audience will be satisfied. I don't know, emotionally or whatever. So we've got to kind of tie a nicer looking bow on the end of it. With the remake, it does do that. I mean, it does try to conclude it a little more, to a little more of a satisfying degree, even though it is brutal and kind of punishing in its own way. But it's nothing like the original. The original really goes to a place that I didn't expect this film to go, because there's a big component to both of these films, to this story as a whole, where the original film is written and directed by filmmaker Christian Tapdruff and Mads Tapdruff. And I really thought, okay, well, the original film has a very unique kind of vision and I think point of view, even though it's trying to give us different perspectives from these different characters. But it is addressing some of the fears that you might have as a parent or as a husband or as a wife, or even as someone who is a foreigner, right? Like someone who's in a new place. Like a lot of those things are addressed in different ways. And the remake is written and directed by James Watkins. Now, I mean, it also credits the original writers of the original film, but it does do something very different. I mean, I think the original works more directly on the drive, the sort of narrative energy of this story. Like, watch what these people are about to go through. You won't believe it. Meanwhile, I think the remake, I think it leans a little too much on the cast. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I like James McAvoy. I like Scoot McNairy. I like Mackenzie Davis. And I just think it's a little bit of stunt casting, at least for me, as someone who's seen these people in other things. I think Scoot McNairy and Mackenzie Davis, like, oh, Halt and Catch Fire. Like it's already just automatically clicks of like, yeah, I know who those two people are. I know how they are together. And then James McAvoy, I mean, there's like a proper like top tier movie star who's also a great actor and a great physical presence, which you need for this kind of character. But I think it's hard to look at the film and not see James McAvoy. The remake kind of gets caught up in that. It's like you're watching these people, you're not watching the emotions that are driving the characters. And when you've got the original film doing all of that work, it's hard. It's a hard comparison, It just doesn't quite shake out so well. The original really does build to such a small degree with every passing moment this sort of uneasiness and this tension, because it does start. I mean, it starts in a way kind of in this mundane like conversation and situation where they're on vacation. I said too many Asians, but it does feel almost kind of boring. Like it feels a little tedious to get through like the first 20 minutes of the film because you're not really sure where it's going. Once this couple visits the other couple at their farmhouse, and you see a couple of things that just don't quite feel right, or they kind of hit wrong, and then watching the characters try to navigate that, in a sort of uneasy way, but trying to, like, keep things smooth, not rock the boat. It's like, oh well, yeah, yeah, that's probably what I would say, or that's probably what I would expect someone to say, and it kind of works. With the remake, I feel like it follows the same structure, but I think you're watching. What would James McAvoy say right now? Yeah, that's what he would say. I knew he was going to do that, and so I think in that respect, the original works way better. Plus, it also just has such a different, like a really brain breaking ending to it, where you really just think, "Wow, they ended the movie like that." Okay, so, would I recommend one over the other? I think I would have to recommend the original. It's not like it's a 20-year-old movie where it clearly looks dated or some things just don't really hold up with the acting or anything like that. I mean, the movie is very recent. And I think if you'd never heard of the remake, or if they didn't even make the remake, I think the original is just fine. And because, I mean, it's a foreign film, it's a foreign production, but it doesn't really feel like it because, like I said, most of the film is in English. So I think there's a good part of the film where you're not really connecting with, oh, this is some other part of the world, even. As an American viewer, this feels like something that I could just as easily have this kind of experience or situation happen here where I live or any other place in the world. It's not so rooted in that specific culture. Now, it does have hints of it, and there are different languages that are part of it, but it's not so much about that. It's much more about the dynamics between the characters. I think the remake, it just feels like it's trying to push a little more like, oh yeah, we're in England, we're talking about London, we're talking about Italy, we're talking about France. And look, kind of remove all that stuff. Put these characters in this bubble, like in the original, and I think it works better. So I'm curious, if this is a type of film that is kind of designed to hit once and just be what it is, or if this is a film that, I don't know, could possibly have some sort of without giving the ending away, I don't know if there's like more to what happens to these characters. I just don't know. I think the original just does something so kind of unique and, I guess, for what it is, original in the sense that it's addressing this kind of thing, this thing that adults living in the world today have to deal with. And I say have to deal with, but you find yourself encountering. So anyway, that's some quick thoughts on that, on the film and then the remake of the film. I usually kind of like to do this when it's a bigger gap and a bigger difference between the two. If it's a film that's been out for decades and then a very recent film, I like to see the differences. I like to see like what's been updated, maybe what's been changed because the times have changed. And in this one, I really honestly for a moment thought, oh, this is going to be almost like a beat for beat remake. Like they're not going to change anything. It did concern me that how would they pull off the ending of the original in the remake for a more kind of wider audience. I didn't really know how that was going to land. And turns out they actually went in a whole different direction. So I guess it's up to an audience. It's up maybe up to you if you watch it, like which one you might prefer and why. I think for me at this point, I like to see a film that really pushes the envelope. And I don't just mean in terms of being graphic or gratuitous, but I just mean push the envelope in terms of the idea, right? Like, will you commit to the idea? The original film, it sets up this idea of what this couple is doing, right? Like what their whole agenda is. And it commits to it 100% to the point where it's like, this isn't the first time it's happened. This isn't the last time it's happened. This is a thing that just goes on in the world. And yeah, you should be afraid of it. In the remake, it does feel like, oh, this is a very finite type of situation. Like this, we're catching this at a very specific point for these characters. Like this is what's happening now. And this might be the very end of the road. Okay, well, I'm trying so hard not to spoil what happens in these movies because I think it's something that I didn't really see where it was going. I really thought it was something else was about to happen, like just in general. But what these films are talking about, the story of it, I think it's deeper than just like the mechanics of the plot and what each character is deciding to do. I think there are bigger things it's trying to address. So, with that in mind, I like both of them. I just think the original works better for me. So, anyway, that's a quick look at those. We're trying to wrap up the year here, so I just wanted to get these two out and talk about these for a minute. But anyway, so look, hey, that was fun. That was quick. Let's get to some other stuff in the next episode. The next episode, I feel like it's going to be a big one. And I hope you stick around and check it out. Thanks for listening for this week, for this episode, and we'll see you later. Go to filmstreak.com if you want to hear some others. You can sign up to get these by email if that just works better for you. And until then, hey, it is what it is, but you go watch something new.